December 16th, 1944, 3:45 in the morning, near Losheim, Belgium. SS-Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper checked his watch one final time as his Kampfgruppe prepared to launch the spearhead of Operation Wacht am Rhein. Around him in the frozen darkness, over 5,000 men and 100 tanks of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler waited in absolute silence. They had 90 minutes before American artillery observers could register their positions at first light, 90 minutes to punch through American lines and reach the bridges over the Meuse River before Allied firepower could concentrate against them. Peiper had fought on the Eastern Front. He knew what artillery could do, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what would happen when American gunners loaded shells with a fuse that contained a complete radio transmitter the size of a wine bottle, packed with miniature vacuum tubes that had somehow survived being fired at 20,000 times the force of gravity. In 90 minutes, Peiper's carefully planned blitzkrieg would collide with a technology German engineers had spent a decade concluding was theoretically impossible, and in the collision, the forests of the Ardennes would be transformed into killing fields where traditional military expertise meant nothing against American industrial capacity. The story of how proximity fuses shattered German offensive operations in the Ardennes began not in the winter forests of Belgium, but in a peculiar quirk of wartime secrecy. For 2.5 years, the Pentagon had maintained absolute restrictions on using proximity fuses over land. The risk was too catastrophic. If a single unexploded shell fell into German hands, enemy engineers might reverse engineer the technology or develop countermeasures. Intelligence analysts estimated that if Germany equipped its anti-aircraft guns with proximity fuses, Allied bomber losses could increase by 300%. The strategic air campaign that was systematically destroying German industrial capacity might become impossible. General Henry Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, had stated flatly that he would rather lose the war than risk proximity fuses being captured and used against American bombers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. So the fuses remained restricted to naval use, where duds would sink harmlessly beyond enemy reach. Over the Pacific, they had revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare. In 1943, proximity-fused shells accounted for more than half of all Japanese aircraft shot down by naval gunfire, despite being used in only 25% of shells fired. By 1944, American ships equipped with proximity fuses could knock kamikaze aircraft from the sky at ranges and success rates that seemed impossible. But over Europe, the secret remained locked away. Even when American artillery could have benefited enormously from airburst shells during the Normandy campaign, the restriction held firm. The technology was simply too valuable to risk. Then Germany launched the Von flying bomb campaign against London in June 1944. The pilotless missiles arrived at 400 miles per hour, faster than many Allied fighters. Initially, British defences could destroy only 17% of the V-1s entering the coastal gun belt. The situation grew desperate as thousands of German missiles struck British cities. Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally authorised breaking the secrecy restriction. British and American anti-aircraft batteries along the English coast received proximity-fused ammunition. Within 4 weeks, the destruction rate climbed to 74%. During one day in late August, 82% of incoming V-1s were shot down. The fuses had proven themselves war-winning technology, but the use over land meant the secret was partially compromised. Thousands of fuses were being fired where German forces might recover them. By December 1944, that calculation was about to change completely. Hitler had been planning his last desperate gamble since September. Operation Wacht am Rhein would commit Germany's final strategic reserve, 2 Panzer armies totaling over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks, to a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all remaining strength against the Soviet Union advancing from the east. Hitler personally selected the Ardennes because he believed the Americans would not expect an attack through the same forested terrain where German panzers had achieved their greatest triumph in May 1940. The terrain was difficult, with few roads and many river obstacles, but that very difficulty would shield German forces from Allied air power and artillery observation. The offensive was scheduled to begin before dawn on December 16th, with simultaneous attacks across an 85-mile front. Weather forecasts predicted heavy cloud cover and fog that would ground Allied aircraft. German commanders felt confident they could achieve surprise and exploit it before American firepower could respond. They were counting on the same advantages that had worked in 1940: concentrated armor, aggressive leadership, and the paralysis that surprise inflicts on defenders. What they did not know was that American artillery had evolved into something fundamentally different from any artillery force in history. And sitting in ammunition depots across Belgium and France were 200,000 shells fitted with fuses containing technology that would turn the carefully planned offensive into a catastrophe. SS-Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper was one of the most experienced and ruthless commanders in the German military. At 29 years old, he had commanded armoured battle groups on the Eastern Front, winning the Knight's Cross with oak leaves for aggressive leadership. His Kampfgruppe for Operation Wacht am Rhein consisted of his own 1st SS Panzer regiment, reinforced with Panzer grenadiers, engineers, and anti-aircraft units, over 5,000 men built around 117 tanks and assault guns, including 42 of the new King Tiger heavy tanks. Peiper's mission was to serve as the spearhead of the entire offensive. His route, designated Rollbahn D, would take him through Losheim, past Stavelot, and Trois Ponts to the bridges over the Meuse River at Rhein. The entire route was 50 miles as the crow flies, but over 100 miles following the narrow, winding roads through the Ardennes. The plan required Peiper to advance with maximum speed and minimal caution. He was explicitly ordered to bypass resistance and push forward. Infantry divisions following behind would eliminate American strongpoints. Peiper's only job was to reach the Meuse before American reinforcements could concentrate. German High Command estimated that if Peiper maintained aggressive momentum, he could reach the river in 2 days, 3 at most. Once across the Meuse with intact bridges, the entire northern wing of the offensive would have its breakthrough. The plan was sound. Peiper was capable. His men were veterans. The tanks were powerful. Everything depended on surprise and speed. Everything depended on having 90 minutes of darkness to achieve penetration before American artillery could observe and respond. At 4 o'clock in the morning on December 16th, German artillery commenced firing. 1,400 guns opened fire simultaneously along the entire front, the heaviest German barrage in the West since 1940. The fire was not particularly accurate. German ammunition shortages meant many shells were older stocks, with deteriorating propellant. But the psychological impact on American defenders was severe. In the northern sector near Losheim, the bombardment fell on positions held by the American 106th Infantry Division, a unit that had arrived in Europe only 4 days earlier. The Green troops endured the barrage in their foxholes, uncertain what was happening. At 5:30 in the morning, the barrage lifted, and German infantry began their assault. Peiper's Kampfgruppe was scheduled to move forward once the infantry had cleared the initial positions and secured the roads. But the infantry advance moved slower than planned. American units, though inexperienced and surprised, defended stubbornly. Key positions at crossroads and villages held longer than German timetables allowed. Peiper sat in his command vehicle, listening to radio reports of infantry struggling to break through, watching precious minutes of darkness tick away. At 6:45, with dawn beginning to break, Peiper made the decision to move forward regardless of whether the infantry had completely cleared the route. He would bypass any remaining resistance and trust his armoured strength to smash through. The column began moving, a steel snake of tanks and vehicles stretching for miles along the narrow roads. They advanced past positions where American soldiers were still fighting, sometimes firing into American positions as they passed, sometimes ignoring them completely in the rush to maintain momentum. By 7:30 in the morning, Peiper's lead tanks reached Honsfeld, a village 5 miles behind the American front line where a rear area unit, The 394th Infantry Regiment's service company was billeted. The Americans were taken completely by surprise. German tanks rolled through the village, destroying vehicles and capturing prisoners. Peiper was pleased. His gamble was paying off. The advance continued toward Bühlingen, where a major American fuel depot sat undefended. If Peiper could capture that fuel, his chronic shortage of gasoline would be solved. The lead tanks entered Bühlingen at 8 o'clock, encountering scattered resistance from American military police and rear echelon troops. The village fell within 30 minutes. Peiper's men began refueling their vehicles from captured American jerry cans, tens of thousands of gallons of high-grade American gasoline, enough to reach the Meuse and beyond. But as the December sun climbed higher in the sky, burning through the morning fog, American artillery observers were beginning to register German movements. Forward observers with the embattled American frontline units had been calling for fire support since the German attack began. Artillery battalions had been responding throughout the morning, but with limited effect. The observers couldn't see targets clearly through the fog and woods. The German advance was too rapid and dispersed to concentrate fire effectively. American gunners were firing with conventional time fuses, set to explode at predetermined altitudes based on estimates and averages. The effectiveness was moderate at best. German soldiers could take cover in foxholes and behind terrain. Many shells burst too high or too low to inflict significant casualties. What neither Peiper nor any German commander knew was that sitting in American ammunition dumps were shells with Mark 32 proximity fuses, a technology so secret that even using them required authorization from the highest levels. On the morning of December 16th, as reports of the German offensive flooded into headquarters, American commanders faced a critical decision. The proximity fuse was America's most closely guarded military secret after the atomic bomb. Using it over land risked German forces recovering unexploded shells and reverse engineering the technology. But the alternative was allowing the German offensive to succeed. At 7:45 in the morning, Colonel Oskar Alfred Axelson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group supporting American forces near Monschau, received reports that German forces were assaulting the 308th Cavalry Squadron. The lightly armed cavalry desperately needed artillery support. Axelson had just received a shipment of proximity-fused shells, code-named POSIT, but Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had not yet formally authorized their use over land in combat. Axelson made the decision that the emergency trumped the restrictions. He ordered his gunners to load and fire the proximity-fused shells. At ranges of 10 to 12 miles, American 1.5 5mm howitzers began firing shells that would explode 20 to 30 feet above the ground with perfect consistency, regardless of terrain or visibility. Each shell sent a cone-shaped pattern of fragments spreading downward, covering an area far larger than conventional ground bursts. Foxholes that would protect soldiers from normal artillery fire became death traps. The shrapnel rained down from above, penetrating even log-reinforced positions. German infantry attacking the cavalry positions suddenly found themselves being torn apart by artillery that exploded overhead. There was no warning. High-velocity shells arrived too quickly to hear approaching. The first indication was the airburst explosion, followed immediately by the lethal rain of steel fragments. The reports that reached German commanders were confused and alarming. Unit after unit reported devastating casualties from American artillery that was somehow exploding above their positions. Medical officers noted that wounds were different from typical artillery casualties. The fragments struck from above, targeting heads and shoulders. Multiple fragment wounds were common. The lethality rate was significantly higher than normal artillery fire. German soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front reported they had never experienced anything like it. Soviet artillery fired massive bombardments that lasted hours, but soldiers could take cover and wait them out. British artillery was accurate and methodical, but it could be predicted and countered. This American artillery was something entirely different. It struck without warning and provided no defense. By 9 o'clock in the morning, 3 hours after Peiper's Kampfgruppe began its advance, American artillery battalions across the entire Ardennes front were receiving reports of the German offensive. Forward observers with frontline units, though many were cut off or overrun, transmitted coordinates and target information before they were silenced. Fire direction centers at battalion, division, and corps level began coordinating responses. The American artillery system that had been perfected over 3 years of war was responding to the crisis, and sitting ready in every ammunition depot were those 200,000 proximity-fused shells, waiting for authorization to be used without restriction. At 9:15 on the morning of December 16th, less than 4 hours after the German offensive began, forward observers spotted Peiper's column moving west from Büllingen toward Moderscheid. The column was moving fast, vehicles spaced at 50-meter intervals, stretching for miles along the narrow road. It was exactly the kind of target American artillery had been designed to destroy, but the observers couldn't call for time-on-target concentrations, with proximity fuses. Not yet. The authorization hadn't come through. They called for conventional fire, harassing Peiper's column with sporadic shells that forced occasional halts but inflicted minimal casualties. Peiper's vehicles simply detoured around craters and continued advancing. The German commander was confident. American artillery was responding exactly as he expected, too little, too late, and without the concentration needed to stop an armored column moving at maximum speed. What Peiper didn't know was that in Luxembourg City, 90 miles south, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, had been awakened before dawn with news of the German attack. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley reviewed the intelligence reports with growing alarm. The German attack was far larger than the typical spoiling attacks the Allies had grown accustomed to. This was a genuine offensive, committing substantial German armor reserves. Bradley immediately telephoned Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. General Eisenhower needed to make the decision about proximity fuses, and he needed to make it now. At 10:30 in the morning on December 16th, Eisenhower received Bradley's call at his headquarters in Versailles. The discussion was brief. Eisenhower had already been briefed on the scope of the German attack. Intelligence officers estimated at least 2 Panzer armies were involved. This was Hitler's last gamble, committed with forces Germany could not replace. If the offensive succeeded in reaching Antwerp, it could set the Allied timetable back by months, perhaps longer. The risk of losing proximity fuse technology to German capture had to be weighed against the risk of losing the entire campaign. Eisenhower made his decision immediately. Use the proximity fuses without restriction. The order went out through channels at 10:45 in the morning, 5 hours after the German offensive began. But formal authorization took time to reach front-line artillery units. Communication networks were disrupted by the German attack. Some units were cut off. Others were in the process of displacing to new positions. The order to use proximity fuses without restriction would take hours to reach every artillery battalion. In the meantime, Peiper's Kampfgruppe continued its advance. By 11 o'clock, his lead tanks reached Moderscheid. The village fell quickly, adding to the growing column of American prisoners marching east. Peiper was now 15 miles behind the original American front line, moving deeper into the American rear area with every passing hour. Resistance was sporadic and disorganized. American units were reacting to the surprise, but they hadn't yet concentrated enough force to stop an armored column of Peiper's strength. At Baugnies, a crossroads south of Malmedy, Peiper's column encountered Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The American unit, composed primarily of lightly armed forward observers and their vehicles, was moving south, unaware that German tanks were in the area. The encounter was brief and one-sided. Peiper's lead tanks opened fire, destroying several American vehicles. The remaining Americans surrendered. Approximately 120 American prisoners were assembled in a field near the crossroads. What happened next would become one of the most infamous atrocities of the war in Western Europe. SS troops opened fire on the unarmed prisoners with machine guns. The massacre lasted approximately 15 minutes. 84 Americans were killed. A few dozen escaped by feigning death and fleeing into the woods when the Germans departed. The Malmedy massacre, as it would become known, was not an isolated incident during Peiper's advance. At Honsfeld that morning, German troops had executed approximately 20 American prisoners, at Büllingen another 15. At various points along Peiper's route, small groups of American prisoners were shot rather than processed. Peiper later claimed he had no knowledge of these killings, that they were unauthorized actions by individual soldiers. But Peiper commanded the unit. The killings occurred repeatedly along his route of advance. Whether he ordered them, authorized them, or simply failed to prevent them, they happened under his command. The brutality would have immediate tactical consequences Peiper did not anticipate. News of the Malmedy massacre spread rapidly through American units. Survivors who escaped carried word to nearby positions. By evening of December 16th, American soldiers throughout the Ardennes knew that German SS troops were executing prisoners. The psychological impact was profound. Units that might have considered surrender when surrounded instead fought to the last. Soldiers who might have shown mercy to German prisoners hardened their attitudes, and critically, American commanders at every level became absolutely determined that Peiper's Kampfgruppe would be stopped and destroyed, regardless of cost. The massacre transformed Peiper from just another German commander into a specific target that every American unit wanted to eliminate. By noon on December 16th, Peiper's column had reached Ligneuville, 18 miles behind the original front line. The advance was still making progress, but it was slowing. American resistance was stiffening as more units became aware of the German penetration. Roads were becoming clogged with Peiper's own vehicles. Fuel was again becoming a concern despite the captures at Büllingen. The winter daylight was already beginning to fade. Peiper needed to maintain momentum, but he was discovering that rapid advance created its own problems. His column was stretched over 20 miles of road. His supply vehicles were far behind. His infantry couldn't keep pace with his tanks. He was deep in American territory with inadequate forces to defend his flanks or his supply line. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the 1st American Artillery Battalion received formal authorization to use proximity fuses without restriction. The 421st Field Artillery Group, supporting the 30th Infantry Division, had been repositioning to block German advances. Their ammunition trucks carried a mixture of conventional and proximity-fused shells. The fire direction officers immediately began planning missions using the proximity fuses. Forward observers were instructed on the capabilities and limitations of the new ammunition. Proximity fuses were most effective against troops in the open or in light cover. They were less effective against armoured vehicles, though they could still kill exposed crew members and accompanying infantry. The key advantage was that every shell was guaranteed to be an airburst at optimal height. There would be no duds, no shells that buried themselves harmlessly in soft ground, no time fuses that exploded too high or too low. At 1:15 in the afternoon, American observers spotted German infantry moving through woods near Stavelot. The infantry belonged to Peiper's Kampfgruppe, deployed to secure the town before his armour pushed through. The observers called for fire. Within 3 minutes, the first proximity-fused shells began impacting. The German infantry, advancing through the trees in tactical formation, suddenly found themselves under artillery fire that exploded at treetop level. The shells burst with perfect consistency, 20 to 30 feet above the ground, sending fragments downward through the forest canopy. The German soldiers attempted to take cover, dropping flat or seeking protection behind trees. It made no difference. The fragments came from directly overhead, penetrating helmets, striking backs and shoulders. SS-Obersturmbannführer Gustav Nittel, commanding the reconnaissance battalion attached to Peiper's Kampfgruppe, was with the infantry when the American barrage began. His after-action report, captured by American forces after the war, described the experience. The shells exploded in the trees above us with no warning. We could not hear them approaching. The fragments fell like rain. Men who had survived 3 years of combat in Russia were killed in seconds. We could not understand how the Americans were achieving such perfect airbursts. We assumed it was some new fuse type, but we had no time to investigate. We had to keep moving, or we would all be killed. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon on December 16th, multiple American artillery battalions across the Ardennes front had received authorization and were firing proximity-fused shells at German formations. The impact on German offensive operations was immediate and devastating. Units that had been advancing steadily suddenly found themselves pinned down by artillery that provided no protection through conventional defensive measures. German commanders began receiving reports of unexpectedly high casualties from American artillery. Medical officers noted the unusual nature of wounds. Intelligence officers tried to determine what new weapon the Americans were employing, but there was no time for systematic investigation. The offensive had to continue. Hitler's orders were explicit: maintain momentum regardless of casualties. Peiper's Kampfgruppe reached Stavelot at 3:30 in the afternoon. The town was defended by a single American engineer company, Company C of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, reinforced with a few stragglers from other units. The engineers had prepared demolitions on the bridge over the Meuse River, but they held their fire, uncertain whether German forces were actually approaching or if the reports were confused. When Peiper's lead tanks appeared, the engineers fought back with bazookas and small arms. The engagement was brief. The Americans lacked the firepower to stop German armor, but critically, the engineers managed to damage the bridge before retreating. The structure was still passable for tracked vehicles, but it would need repairs before Peiper's heavier King Tiger tanks could cross safely. The delay at Stavelot was exactly the kind of friction Peiper could not afford. Every hour of delay allowed American forces to organize defenses ahead of him and reinforcements to arrive. At 4 o'clock, as winter darkness was falling, Peiper made the decision to continue advancing with his lighter tanks, while engineers repaired the bridge for his heavy armor to follow. The column pushed on toward Trois Ponts, 6 miles west, where 3 rivers converged and multiple bridges offered routes toward the Meuse. Peiper was still 40 miles from his objective, and he had already been advancing for 12 hours. His men were exhausted, his vehicles were running on fumes, and behind him, American forces were beginning to converge. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 4:30 in the afternoon, American engineers at Trois Ponts received warning that German armor was approaching. The engineers belonged to Company C of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion. Their mission was to defend the bridges and demolish them if necessary to prevent German crossings. The commander, First Lieutenant Alvin Edelstein, had already prepared demolitions on all 3 bridges. When Peiper's lead tanks appeared at 5 o'clock, driving through the darkness with only blackout lights, the engineers opened fire with a single anti-tank gun. The first shot missed. The second struck a German tank, damaging it. Peiper's tanks returned fire, but in the darkness and confusion, they couldn't locate the American positions. Edelstein gave the order. The engineers detonated charges on the bridge over the Meuse River. The structure collapsed into the river, blocking Peiper's direct route west. Peiper was forced to detour. The alternate route led northwest through La Glaise and Stoumont toward Targnon and Verbermont, where other bridges might offer crossing points. But every detour cost time and fuel, and American artillery was becoming increasingly active. Throughout the evening and night of December 16th, American artillery battalions fired harassment missions at suspected German locations. Many of these missions used proximity-fused shells, transforming night movement from relatively safe into extremely dangerous. German soldiers attempting to advance under cover of darkness found themselves being killed by shells that exploded overhead with no warning and no visible means of observation. The psychological impact was severe. German infantry became reluctant to move. Vehicle drivers bunched up on roads, seeking safety in proximity to other vehicles rather than maintaining proper spacing. This bunching created even more lucrative targets for American artillery. By midnight on December 16th, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had advanced 25 miles from its start line, but it was still 35 miles from the Meuse River. The advance had consumed all of the first day and had achieved less than half the planned progress. Worse, Peiper's supply line was cut. American forces had reoccupied Stavelot behind him, trapping his column in a salient with no way to bring forward fuel or ammunition. Peiper gathered his commanders for a midnight conference in La Glaise. The situation was serious, but not yet desperate. His tanks still had some fuel. His men still had ammunition. If they could break through to the Meuse quickly, they could link up with other German forces and re-establish supply. The alternative was to retreat back through Stavelot, fighting through American forces that now blocked his rear. Peiper decided to continue the attack. At first light on December 17th, his column would push on toward Stoumont and Werbermont. What Peiper could not know was that during the night of December 16th to 17th, American forces throughout the Ardennes were receiving massive shipments of proximity-fused ammunition. Trucks loaded with the special shells were rolling forward from depots in France and Luxembourg. Artillery battalions that had fired their initial stocks of proximity fuses were being resupplied, with thousands more. And most critically, American commanders at every level now understood the effectiveness of the new ammunition. Fire plans were being written specifically to exploit proximity fuse capabilities. Forward observers were being instructed to call for proximity-fused fire against any German formation in the open. The American artillery system, already the most effective in the world, was about to demonstrate what it could accomplish with unlimited access to its most lethal ammunition. At dawn on December 17th, Peiper's tanks moved out from La Glaise towards Stoumont. The column advanced about a mile before encountering American defensive positions. The 30th Infantry Division had moved into blocking positions during the night, reinforced with tank destroyers and artillery. Peiper's lead tanks engaged the American positions, trading fire at close range in the narrow valley. American tank destroyers knocked out several German vehicles. German tanks destroyed American positions. The battle was fierce but inconclusive. Neither side could gain decisive advantage in the close terrain. Then, at 7:30 in the morning, American artillery opened fire on Peiper's column with proximity-fused shells. The effect was catastrophic. The German vehicles were packed closely on the narrow road, unable to disperse due to the terrain. The proximity-fused shells exploded overhead, raining fragments down on the column. Tank commanders who had been standing in open hatches for visibility were killed or wounded. Infantry riding on the tanks were swept away. Unarmored vehicles were riddled with holes. In 10 minutes of concentrated fire, Peiper's advance stalled completely. The column could not move forward against American defences and could not remain in place under the devastating artillery fire. SS-Obersturmbannführer Arndt Fischer, commanding a platoon of Panther tanks in Peiper's column, described the barrage in his post-war memoir. "We had experienced Soviet artillery barrages that lasted hours. We had fought through British artillery in Normandy, but we had never experienced anything like what the Americans did to us that morning. The shells exploded above us without warning. We could not see the observers. We could not predict when the fire would come, and when it came, there was no defense. Men died inside their vehicles from fragments that penetrated vision slits and hatches. The psychological effect was worse than the casualties. My men refused to expose themselves. We sat paralyzed, waiting for the next salvo, unable to fight and unable to retreat." Peiper attempted to flank the American positions, sending tanks through the woods north of the road. American forward observers spotted the movement immediately and called for fire. Proximity-fused shells burst in the trees, killing the accompanying infantry and forcing the tanks to withdraw. By noon on December 17th, Peiper's attack towards Stoumont had been completely stopped. He had gained less than 2 miles in 6 hours of fighting and had lost dozens of vehicles and hundreds of men. For the first time since the offensive began, Peiper began to question whether his mission was achievable. Behind Peiper's position, American forces were systematically destroying his supply line. At Stavelot, American infantry and tanks attacked the German forces holding the town. American artillery saturated the area with proximity-fused shells, making German defensive positions untenable. By evening of December 17th, Stavelot was back in American hands. Peiper's Kampfgruppe was now completely cut off, trapped in a pocket around La Glaise with no supply, no reinforcements, and no route of retreat. The Germans had fuel for perhaps another day of operations. Ammunition was already running low, medical supplies were critically short, and American artillery continued to fire harassment missions throughout the day and night, using proximity-fused shells that made every moment dangerous and every position vulnerable. On December 18th, Peiper made one final attempt to break through to the Meuse. His remaining tanks attacked toward Verbermont, hoping to find a weak point in American defenses. The attack was met by concentrated American artillery fire using proximity fuses. The German tanks advanced into a storm of steel fragments raining from the sky. Tank commanders were killed, infantry were swept away, unarmored vehicles were destroyed. After advancing less than a mile, Peiper called off the attack. His Kampfgruppe had shot its bolt. The spearhead of Operation Wacht am Rhein, the force that was supposed to reach the Meuse River in 2 days and open the route to Antwerp, was trapped in a pocket 6 miles deep and 3 miles wide, surrounded by American forces and being systematically destroyed by American artillery, armed with shells that turned the very air into a weapon. The next 4 days saw Peiper's Kampfgruppe slowly strangled. American artillery fired round-the-clock missions into the pocket. Forward observers had perfect observation from surrounding heights. Every German movement drew immediate fire. The proximity-fused shells made any position in the pocket a death trap. German casualties mounted steadily. Wounded men could not be evacuated. Dead men could not be buried. Vehicles that were damaged could not be repaired for lack of parts. Tanks that ran out of fuel became pillboxes, then obstacles, then targets for American artillery. The SS soldiers, elite troops who had fought across Europe for 5 years, experienced something they had never encountered before: absolute helplessness against an enemy who could kill them from beyond visual range, without warning and without defense. SS-Rottenführer Karl Wortmann, a veteran of the Eastern Front serving in Peiper's Kampfgruppe, kept a diary throughout the encirclement. His entries captured the deteriorating situation. December 18th. The Americans are shelling us continuously. The shells explode above our heads. We cannot defend ourselves. We can only wait to be killed. December 19th. Half my squad is dead or wounded. We have no medical supplies. The American artillery never stops. How do they have so many shells? December 20th. We tried to break out during the night. The American artillery found us in complete darkness and fired airburst shells that killed men I could not even see. They can see in the dark. They can shoot through clouds. They are not human. December 21st. Peiper has ordered us to abandon our vehicles and escape on foot. The Kampfgruppe no longer exists. We are just trying to survive. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, Peiper gave the order to abandon all vehicles and heavy weapons and escape on foot. The SS soldiers destroyed their own tanks to prevent capture, then infiltrated through American lines in small groups under cover of darkness. Peiper led approximately 800 men, all that remained of his original force of over 5,000, on a nighttime march through the woods. They moved in single file, absolutely silent, leaving behind their wounded who could not walk. American artillery continued to fire throughout the night, but in the darkness and forest, the Germans were able to slip through gaps in the American lines. By dawn on December 24th, Peiper and his survivors had reached German lines. The Kampfgruppe that was supposed to lead Hitler's last great offensive in the West had been completely destroyed. Of the 117 tanks and assault guns that began the attack, exactly 0 reached the Meuse River. Most were abandoned in the La Glaise pocket. The rest were destroyed during the advance or retreat. American forces examining the abandoned German vehicles in La Glaise found something interesting. In several vehicles, German soldiers had collected fragments from American artillery shells that had exploded nearby. Some fragments showed evidence of having been studied, with German soldiers attempting to understand the fuse mechanism. In one vehicle, American troops found a nearly intact proximity fuse that had failed to detonate. The Germans had apparently recovered it and were examining it, trying to understand what technology allowed such perfect airbursts. But the Germans never had enough time or technical resources to properly analyze what they had found. Even if they had, The sophistication of the proximity fuse was beyond anything German industry could replicate in the time remaining. The destruction of Peiper's Kampfgruppe was only the most dramatic example of proximity fuse's impact during the Battle of the Bulge. Throughout the Ardennes, from December 16th through January, American artillery fired over 200,000 proximity-fused shells at German formations. Throughout the Ardennes, from December 16th through January, American artillery fired over 200,000 proximity-fused shells at German formations. The impact extended far beyond Peiper's destroyed Kampfgruppe. Every German unit that participated in the offensive experienced the devastating effectiveness of artillery that exploded overhead with perfect consistency. The psychological impact proved as significant as the physical casualties. German soldiers who had endured years of combat on the Eastern Front reported that American proximity-fused artillery created a unique form of helplessness they had never experienced before. Obergefreiter Heinrich Severloh, serving with the 2nd Panzer Division during its advance toward Dinant, described his unit's experience in a post-war interview. "We had been told the Americans were soft, that they relied on material superiority because they lacked fighting spirit. Then we encountered their artillery. It was not a question of fighting spirit. It was a question of technology we could not counter. The shells exploded above us, wherever we went. In forests, in fields, in villages. There was no safe place. Men became afraid to move, afraid to concentrate, afraid to do anything that might draw American artillery fire. We lost our offensive spirit not because we lacked courage, but because we learned that courage meant nothing against weapons that killed without giving us a chance to fight back." The 2nd Panzer Division's experience illustrated how proximity fuses disrupted German offensive operations at every level. The division advanced farther west than any other German unit during the Battle of the Bulge, reaching to within 4 miles of the Meuse River near Dinant by December 23rd. But the advance came at catastrophic cost. American artillery, using proximity-fused shells, targeted German assembly areas, supply columns, and troop concentrations with devastating effect. German commanders found that traditional tactics had become suicidal. Concentrating forces for attack drew immediate artillery fire that inflicted casualties before the attack could even begin. Dispersing forces to avoid artillery fire made coordinated attacks impossible. The division was caught in an impossible dilemma with no tactical solution. On December 24th, with German forces stalled throughout the Ardennes and Allied reinforcements arriving in overwhelming strength, the weather cleared. American fighter bombers took to the skies in their thousands, adding air attack to the artillery fire that was already destroying German formations. The combination was devastating. German units attempting to move in daylight were attacked from the air. German units attempting to shelter in place were targeted by artillery using proximity fuses that made every defensive position vulnerable. By December 26th, the German offensive had completely stalled. By January 1st, 1945, American forces had begun their counteroffensive. By January 16th, all German gains had been eliminated, and the front line was back where it had been a month earlier. The cost to Germany was catastrophic. Between December 16th and January 16th, German forces suffered approximately 100,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. More critically, they lost over 800 tanks and assault guns, thousands of vehicles, and vast quantities of ammunition and supplies. These losses came from Germany's strategic reserve, the last mobile forces capable of conducting offensive operations. The men and equipment lost in the Ardennes could not be replaced. From January 1945 onward, German forces in the West would be capable only of defensive operations, and those would be increasingly ineffective as resources dwindled. American casualties during the Battle of the Bulge totaled approximately 81,000, including 19,000 killed. These were serious losses, but unlike Germany, America could replace them. New divisions were arriving in Europe continuously. Replacements flowed from training camps in the United States. Equipment losses were made good from production facilities that were still operating at full capacity. The material balance of the war had shifted so decisively in America's favor that even the largest German offensive could not change the strategic equation. Germany was fighting a war of diminishing returns, spending irreplaceable resources to achieve temporary tactical gains that were quickly reversed. German prisoners captured during the Battle of the Bulge provided American intelligence officers with insights into how proximity fuses had affected German morale and tactics. Major General Edwin L. Sibert, intelligence officer for the 12th Army Group, conducted systematic interviews with German officers throughout January and February 1945. The consistent theme in these interviews was that proximity-fused artillery had created a psychological impact beyond its physical destructiveness. German officers reported that their men had developed a specific fear of American artillery that was different from normal combat stress. Soldiers who had functioned effectively under Soviet artillery barrages became paralyzed by fear when American proximity-fused shells began exploding overhead. One German artillery officer, Hauptmann Werner Scholz, captured near Bastogne in early January, provided a particularly detailed analysis. "We had experienced American artillery during the summer campaigns in France. It was effective but not fundamentally different from what we had encountered elsewhere. But in the Ardennes, something changed. The Americans were firing shells that exploded perfectly every time, at exactly the right height to maximize casualties. We could not understand how they achieved such consistency. Our intelligence officers speculated about new fuse technology, but we could not analyze it properly under combat conditions. What we knew for certain was that our defensive tactics no longer worked. Foxholes that protected against conventional artillery became graves when American shells exploded overhead. Our men lost faith in their own ability to survive. When soldiers believe they cannot survive regardless of their actions, they lose the will to fight." Scholz's analysis identified the critical psychological mechanism through which proximity fuses achieved their effect. Combat soldiers can endure extraordinary dangers if they believe their skills and training provide some chance of survival. Taking cover from artillery fire, digging proper defensive positions, using terrain effectively, these skills gave soldiers agency and hope. Proximity fuses removed that agency. No amount of training or skill could protect against shells that burst overhead with perfect consistency. Soldiers found themselves helpless, dependent entirely on chance for survival. This helplessness broke morale faster than any amount of propaganda or indoctrination could sustain it. The technological implications also affected German prisoners' understanding of the war's trajectory. SS-Obersturmbannführer Gustav Knittel, Peiper's reconnaissance commander who was captured during the escape from La Glaise, spoke extensively with American interrogators about proximity fuses. "When we first encountered the airburst shells, we assumed the Americans had developed an improved time fuse with better quality control, but the consistency was too perfect. Every shell exploded at optimal height. Eventually we recovered shell fragments and saw evidence of unusual fuse mechanisms. Some of my men found what appeared to be a small radio transmitter in a shell nose. We could not believe what we were seeing. A radio transmitter that could survive being fired from a gun was theoretically impossible. German engineers had explored the concept and concluded it could not be built with available technology." Knittel's revelation about finding radio components in proximity fuses captured a broader German realization. The proximity fuse represented not just a clever innovation, but a fundamental difference in industrial and scientific capability. Germany had explored proximity fuse concepts, concluded they were impossible given available resources, and abandoned the programs. America had faced the same technical challenges and solved them through massive application of resources and innovative engineering. The miniature vacuum tubes that survived artillery acceleration, the reserve batteries that activated through centrifugal force, the radio circuits that functioned perfectly after experiencing 20,000 times the force of gravity. All of these required not just clever design, but an industrial base capable of mass-producing sophisticated electronics with extraordinary quality control. "When I learned what the Americans had built," Knittel continued in his interrogation, "I understood that Germany had already lost the war, We were fighting with the industrial capacity of the 1930s against an enemy with the industrial capacity of the future. The proximity fuse was not just a weapon, it was proof that American engineering could accomplish things we had dismissed as impossible. If they could build miniature radios that fit inside artillery shells, what else could they build? What other impossible weapons were waiting to be used against us? This psychological impact extended beyond individual prisoners to German military leadership. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of operations for the German High Command, reportedly stated in March 1945 that the failure of the Ardennes offensive convinced him the war was lost. The offensive had been conceived as Germany's last chance to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated settlement in the West. It had failed not because of German tactical errors or lack of fighting spirit, but because American material superiority had become so overwhelming that German forces could not achieve operational objectives, regardless of how well they fought. Proximity-fused artillery was one element of that material superiority, but it symbolized the broader reality. America was fighting a 21st-century war with weapons German industry could not match, and tactics German doctrine could not counter. The strategic implications of proximity fuses extended beyond the Battle of the Bulge. From January through May 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany, American artillery continued to use proximity-fused ammunition as standard. German defensive positions that might have been held for days or weeks with conventional artillery fire collapsed in hours when subjected to proximity-fused barrages. German casualties from artillery increased dramatically. German soldiers' willingness to defend positions decreased correspondingly. The acceleration of Allied victory in the final months of the war owed much to the presence of proximity fuses in American ammunition stocks. The production statistics behind this military effectiveness were staggering. From December 1944 through May 1945, American factories produced over 4 million proximity fuses. These fuses were distributed to artillery battalions throughout Europe and the Pacific. The cost per fuse had fallen to $18 through mass production techniques, making them economically viable for routine use. At $18 per fuse, the weapon was expensive but justified by its effectiveness. A proximity-fused shell was worth 5 to 10 conventional shells in terms of casualties inflicted. Since the shell itself cost the same regardless of fuse type, paying extra for a fuse that multiplied effectiveness was obvious value. The broader lesson of proximity fuses during the Battle of the Bulge was about the nature of modern warfare. German military doctrine emphasized tactical excellence, operational flexibility, and individual initiative. These were important qualities, and German forces displayed them throughout the war. But by 1944, tactical excellence was no longer sufficient. American forces had developed systematic superiority, better logistics, better communications, better integration of arms, and technological advantages like proximity fuses that multiplied the effectiveness of existing capabilities. The combination of systematic superiority and industrial abundance proved decisive. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote to the War Department in January 1945, specifically praising proximity fuses. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Meuse River and hit them with a concentrated barrage of VT-fused shells. By actual count, we killed 702 enemy soldiers. I have never seen such concentrated destruction from artillery fire. When all armies have this weapon, we will need to devise entirely new methods of warfare. I am glad you thought of it first. Patton's letter captured both the tactical impact of proximity fuses and the strategic advantage they provided. If Germany had developed proximity fuses first, the entire course of the war might have been different. The counterfactual was chilling. German anti-aircraft guns equipped with proximity fuses could have inflicted unsustainable casualties on Allied bomber formations. The strategic air campaign that destroyed German industrial capacity might have been impossible. German artillery using proximity fuses during the D-Day landings might have made the Normandy invasion unsustainable. German defenders, armed with proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition, might have shot down the airborne forces that secured critical bridges and crossroads. Every major Allied operation relied on air superiority and successful amphibious or airborne operations. Proximity fuses in German hands could have denied all of these advantages, but Germany never developed proximity fuses at scale because German resources were insufficient. The German economy was smaller than the American economy. German industrial capacity was being destroyed by Allied bombing. German research and development resources were divided among dozens of advanced weapon programs, from jet aircraft to ballistic missiles to guided anti-ship weapons. Germany was attempting to achieve through innovation what it lacked in industrial capacity. America was achieving through industrial capacity what it might have lacked in innovation, though in fact, American innovation was also superior. The proximity fuse demonstrated that America possessed both innovation and industrial capacity in quantities that Germany could not match. The story of SS commanders and proximity fuses in the Ardennes is ultimately a story about the transformation of warfare in the 20th century. For thousands of years, warfare had been dominated by human factors: courage, skill, leadership, morale. These remained important, but by 1944 they had been subordinated to industrial and technological factors, the side that could produce more weapons, better weapons, and more sophisticated weapons would win regardless of relative fighting quality. Peiper's Kampfgruppe contained some of the most experienced, best trained, most highly motivated soldiers in the German military. They were destroyed not because they fought poorly, but because they were facing an enemy with technological advantages that made traditional military excellence irrelevant. The 90 minutes that Peiper counted on 90 minutes of darkness to achieve breakthrough before American artillery could respond proved to be a fantasy. American artillery could observe through darkness using sound ranging and flash spotting. American artillery could coordinate fire from multiple batteries using fire direction centers and communication networks. And critically, American artillery could fire shells that required no ranging shots, no adjustment, no time fuses set by estimate. Every proximity-fused shell was guaranteed to be a perfect airburst at optimal height. The combination of these capabilities meant that German forces were never safe, never concealed, never beyond American artillery's reach. The forests of the Ardennes, which Hitler had chosen because he believed they would shield German forces from American firepower, became killing fields, where proximity-fused shells burst in the trees and rained death from above. German soldiers who survived the Battle of the Bulge carried memories of proximity-fused artillery for the rest of their lives. In post-war reunions and interviews, veterans consistently identified American artillery as the most devastating weapon they faced. Not tanks, not aircraft, not small arms artillery, and specifically, proximity-fused artillery that created a constant, inescapable threat. One veteran, speaking at a reunion in 1978, stated simply, "We could fight tanks. We could hide from aircraft. We could not fight or hide from artillery that exploded above our heads wherever we went. It killed the strong and the weak, the skilled and the unskilled, the brave and the coward without distinction. It was the weapon that proved we had lost not just the battle, but the war." The proximity fuse stands as testament to American industrial and scientific capability in World War II. It was not the largest program. The Manhattan Project was larger. It was not the most complex program. The B-29 bomber required more innovation. But it was perhaps the most perfectly executed program, combining advanced technology with practical engineering and mass production in quantities that made strategic impact. Over 22 million proximity fuses were produced during the war. They shot down thousands of enemy aircraft, killed hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, and provided American forces with a technological advantage that accelerated victory and saved Allied lives. For Joachim Peiper, trapped in La Glaise with his Kampfgruppe being destroyed around him, the proximity fuse represented the final lesson of World War II. Germany had started the war with tactical and operational advantages that enabled spectacular victories. But tactical advantages proved temporary. Operational flexibility proved insufficient. What mattered in the end was industrial capacity and technological innovation, applied systematically over years of sustained effort. America possessed both in quantities that Germany could never match. The shells exploding overhead, arriving without warning and providing no defense, taught that lesson with brutal efficiency. The 90 minutes Peiper had counted on became 90 hours of being slowly destroyed by an enemy he could not see and could not fight. And when he finally escaped on foot, leaving behind all his vehicles and most of his men, he carried with him the knowledge that Germany had been fighting a war it could never win against an enemy whose capabilities exceeded anything German doctrine had prepared for. The Ardennes forests turned red not from autumn leaves, but from German casualties inflicted by artillery that represented the future of warfare. Peiper's SS commanders had their 90 minutes, but those 90 minutes led only to destruction at the hands of technology they had never imagined possible. The proximity fuse had arrived, and with it, the age of American technological supremacy in military affairs had been born. German military excellence, forged through years of war across Europe, proved helpless against shells that burst overhead with perfect consistency, fired by an enemy with unlimited resources and unmatched industrial capacity. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, industrial democracy would defeat military tradition. Systematic superiority would overcome tactical brilliance, and technology produced in millions would triumph over courage displayed by thousands. The forests of the Ardennes were where that lesson was written in steel and blood, where German commanders learned in 90 minutes of darkness that they were facing an enemy capable of accomplishing the impossible, and where the Third Reich's last offensive died under a rain of fragments falling from shells that should not have existed but did, produced by the tens of thousands, fired without restraint, and devastating beyond anything doctrine or experience had prepared German soldiers to endure. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.